Hello, my name is Clayton Witt, and this is a video presentation regarding the research that I have been conducting over the course of this class. The research established here will focus specifically on the concept of liberty in early American colonial rhetoric, as well as in the minds of the Founding Fathers. The purpose of this video is specifically to identify the main influences of founding rhetoric as related to the concept of liberty. And I've identified two strains particularly where most of this influence comes from. These are both of a biblical nature and of a more secular nature. So one of them is biblical, and the other being more philosophical or secular in nature. These strains combine to give the mind of early colonial America its pulse, and they are drawn from, in equal measure, by the American founders. It is, of course, an impossible task to identify all strains of influence. Therefore, I have selected specific documents, both primary and secondary, that will give a good overview of the mind of the Founding Fathers. I believe this topic is of prime importance to today's time period, particularly because there are many questions regarding the nature of liberty. There are many questions, and there are, of course, many answers. Unfortunately, though, many of those answers do not look back to the founders' specific writings and the founders' influences. In order to fully understand the concept of liberty from the founders' perspective, we must look to what the founders wrote and also what they read. So we turn first to biblical influences. And in doing so, I've identified specific influences dealing with preachers, as well as from the Bible itself, and from leading scholars on the subject. First, I would note from Daniel Dreisbach, who is a scholar in this area, and has done a lot of work identifying the exact level of influence the Bible had on colonial society. Granted, this is not just influence on political discourse or government discourse, although that is clearly in his research, but also an influence on the primary importance of the Bible as a tool of education, and as a tool of moral correction for the children growing up in the colonies. Many of the founders themselves would learn to read and write from biblical texts. From the Bible itself, Daniel Dreisbach has identified two significant verses that were particularly within the minds of colonial people. Galatians 5:1 says, "Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty wherewith Christ hath made us free, and be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage." The other verse, 2 Corinthians 3:17, also has liberty connotations. The verse is very plain and says, "Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty." These two verses embody the direction that colonial thought was going during the time period of the American founding. But we can go back even farther during the early colonial period with a man by the name of William Penn, who also emphasized liberty, this point being religious liberty. William Penn was a Quaker who, becoming upset with the way that the Anglican Church was behaving, decided to join the Society of Friends, which is an organization of Quakers. Their main purpose was focusing on the inner light of individuals. This inner light meant that all were open to receiving the gospel. Penn was notably jailed in Newgate Prison. While in Newgate Prison, Penn wrote The Case of Liberty of Conscience, which is in 1671. This sets up a concept of religious liberty. And this sets up particularly ideas that will be distilled down to Thomas Jefferson. We move beyond these passages back to secondary sources. Exodus was another book of the Bible that founders actually significantly drew from. John Coffey has written a work entitled God's Favorite People, in which he discusses this specifically in relation to the founding generation. He says, as in the 17th century, political sermons were preached almost exclusively from Old Testament texts, but the Patriots blended Protestantism with radical Whig ideology in a manner that recalled Milton rather than the founders of New England. Like the parliamentarians of the mid-17th century, colonial Americans came to see themselves as oppressed Hebrews under the Egyptian yoke. We go down farther, and we see that the Egyptian analogy is continued, particularly with John Adams in 1773, who said that in the wake of the Boston Tea Party, that by accepting the principle of taxation without representation, the colonists would be subjecting ourselves and our posterity forever to Egyptian taskmasters. It is also notable that Benjamin Franklin's proposal for the Great Seal of the United States was that specific scene from Exodus of God guiding the Israelites through the wilderness with the cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night. Of course, it wasn't chosen, but it still highlights the religious and specifically the influences of Exodus on the founding and on the founders themselves. The founders gained influence also from several prominent political thinkers of the day. One of these is particularly John Locke. John Locke's second treatise is important because it highlights the social compact theory that is so often attributed to the founders. In Locke's second treatise, he says, "But if a long train of abuses, prevarications, and artifices, all tending the same way, make the design visible to the people, and they cannot but feel what they lie under, and see whither they are going, it is not to be wondered that they should then rouse themselves, and endeavor to put the rule into such hands, which may secure to them the ends for which government was at first erected." John Locke is often looked at as one of the main influences on the Declaration of Independence, and you can see by the writings and by the quotes that I had previously said that this is the case. Another prominent member of the train of influences for the founders was William Blackstone, who was a legal jurist from Great Britain, had a profound effect on the colonist idea of law. And particularly, John Adams had very positive things to say about him. Blackstone suggests, in his famous work, Commentaries on the Laws of England, he says, absolute rights are those which are so in their primary and strictest sense, much as would belong to their persons merely in a state of nature, in which every man is entitled to enjoy, whether out of society or in it. He says the principal aim of society is to protect individuals in the enjoyment of these absolute rights, which were vested in them by the immutable laws of nature, but which could not be preserved in peace without the mutual assistance and intercourse which is gained by the institution of friendly and social communities. So in this sense, the rights of an individual cannot be retained except for by government. Therefore, liberty is retained through social communities, as Blackstone suggests. We see also from the work of John Milton that there's a difference between liberty and license. Within the tenure of kings and magistrates, John Milton writes, "If men within themselves would be governed by reason and not generally give up their understanding to a double tyranny of custom from without and blind affections within, they would discern better what it is to favor and uphold the tyrant of a nation." He goes further, "For indeed none can love freedom heartily but good men. The rest love not freedom but license, which never hath more scope or more indulgence than under tyrants. Good men enjoy liberty, while bad men enjoy license. A moral people are needed to enjoy liberty. Good men enjoy liberty, as he says. But bad men enjoy tyranny in the form of license." Finally, we look to the founders themselves. Now again, it is not possible to look at every single founding father or every single colonial member of prominence, but I do highlight two important individuals. One of them, John Adams, and the other one, James Madison. John Adams suggests, in his Thoughts on Government, that a man must be indifferent to the sneers of modern Englishmen, to mention in their company the names of Sidney, Harrington, Locke, Milton, Needham, Neville, Burnet, and Hoadley. No small fortitude is necessary to confess that one has read them. The wretched condition of this country, however, for 10 or 15 years past, has frequently reminded me of their principles and reasonings. They will convince any candid mind that there is no good government but what is republican, or separate from monarchy. John Adams notes that these influences focus particularly towards a republican system of government. That is a government that, like Blackstone suggests and Milton suggests, protects liberty, allows for liberty, and protects the natural rights or individual rights of its citizens. We also move to James Madison, who is talking in this article on property about property, but suggests that property is not just physical, but also non-material. He says, in the latter sense, man has a property in his opinions in the free communication of them. This is James Madison speaking. He is a popular of peculiar value in his religious opinions, and in the profession and practice dictated by them. He has a property very dear to him in the safety and liberty of his person. In a word, as a man is said to have a right to his property, he may be equally said to have a property in his rights. So again, we have James Madison, along with John Adams, and along with Milton and Blackstone and several of the other preachers and thinkers that I've alluded to during this discussion, suggesting that a good government, a government that is particular for liberty, is one that protects the natural rights of individuals and punishes those who deprive individuals of their natural rights. We don't have an excess of authority, nor do we have an excess of liberty, or as Milton would say, license. Because in that sense, an excess of liberty turns into license. But we have a government and a system that was fashioned by the founders, particularly to do just what these authors and writers suggested. And that is to protect my individual rights, protect your individual rights. And also punish those who deprive myself or yourself from enjoying those individual rights. And as Madison says, that is the end of government.